Hello everyone, can you hear me? Okay. Um, Hello everyone, welcome to our latest installment of the African Center of the Study for the United States US Elections webinar series. So for the past few weeks, beginning in September onwards until the elections in November, we have been discussing we've been having a series of ongoing conversations regarding the United States elections where we see Vice President Kamala Harris running against former President um, former President Donald Trump. So now we see this has been ongoing because now it's a need for dialogue from people within the African continent and also outside of the African continent in the US itself to see what are the implications of these elections on US-Africa relations. What are the implications of these elections on the US itself? And what are the implications for Africa as a continent? So today in this installment of our webinar series. The topic is entitled The Role of Change in Geopolitics and the Role of BRICS. What are the geopolitical implications of a Harris or Trump presidency for Africa with a focus on the BRICS plus nations? So today we have one distinguished speaker that is joining us today, and that is Dr. Pakesi Heto. So Dr. Pakwesi is a distinguished political economist and development expert. Currently, he serves as the president and CEO of the Indie Education Initiative. Pakwesi has worked with a team that advised the Common Market of Eastern and Southern Africa on their trade and investment policy. He has also worked at the World Bank and evaluated the efficiency of trade gateways in the countries where the trade facilitation facilities operated and the ability of COMESA countries to implement the 2013 World Trade Organization Bale Trade Facilitation Agreement. He's also served as a media relations volunteer for the 2013 Obama Presidential Inauguration Committee and also served as a judge for the United States Agency for International Development and the West African Union's African Diaspora Marketplace Startup US competition. Pakwesi is a transdisciplinary scholar with 5 master's degrees in behavioral mathematics, demography, and social analysis, political science, education, and international affairs. And another fun fact about Pakwesi is that along with his 5 master's degrees, he has also worked and studied on 5 continents. Hello to you, Pakwesi, or good morning on your case as you're joining us from Los Angeles. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you very much. And just one quick footnote, I did not work for the World Bank. I was just a consultant.
Okay.
So,
Okay, thank you for
yeah.
that. Yes. So we were also supposed to be joined by another speaker, Dr. Cliff Mboya, who unfortunately could not join us today due to uh, unfortunate circumstance. So today we'll be needing a lot of dialogue from myself and Pakwesi, as well as from the audience who is joining us from this Zoom meeting, as well as online on our YouTube stream. So we'll be starting off with the first touch point about these elections and their implications on BRICS and geopolitics at large. Can you please tell us what is the key geopolitical goal of BRICS and how do these goals challenge or complement the United States' role or positionality as a global leader in economics, security, and other disciplines and trades?
Uh, thank you for inviting me. I'm happy, I'm glad to be here. Um, I think the most important thing we have to think about when we're talking about the BRICS is that on the one plane, the BRICS to the United States Um, it's a different view if you're looking at it from the United States perspective than if you're looking at it from the BRICS perspective. So if you're looking at it from the BRICS perspective or the BRICS nations themselves, initially it started off as a group of nations that wanted that were emerging, that were um, growing at a faster pace, and thought of coming together to continue to foster that growth. So on one plane, the geopolitical goal then could just be you know solidarity to advance each other's growth. But over time, the BRICS appears to be morphing into, call it, a coalition of countries that wanted to champion a new world order. That is how, maybe if you're looking at it from the United States perspective, if you're looking at it also from recent Russian pronouncements, it's as though the BRICS is becoming a bloc
Mm.
against the West.
Mm.
And I think that is a very, very dangerous uh, positioning at this point.
Okay. So, based off of this that you just stated, the creation of this idea of a bloc as the BRICS bloc or BRICS plus bloc, do you think that the BRICS nations can or will eventually effectively place themselves as a counterbalance to the United States, or will the current I'd say with the current multipolar geopolitical situation continue, or do you see BRICS effectively positioning itself as a opposite polar to be an opposite power or bloc from the US and its allies?
On what level we are actually in the middle of, call it, a great power transition.
Mm.
We are going through that period of transition where we don't know what is going to come after. We
Mm.
are already going through it, and since we're already going through it, it feels that there's a lot of uncertainty. It also feels that uh, there is an emerging level of chaos.
Mm.
If you think about uh, some of the wars going on and how ineffective the multilateral institutions have been in addressing those conflicts,
Mm.
and our inability to even marshal a united front to put pressure on those on aggressors to
Mm.
stop what they are doing. Thinking about Russia, thinking about what is going on between Russia and Ukraine, in between Israel, in Gaza, in Lebanon, how the global community or the international community has been quite ineffective
Mm.
in bringing pressure to stop those conflicts. Then you could understand that we are sort of no longer in the unipolar world that we had post 1991.
Mm.
The question then becomes what is going to come after. And some people think the BRICS is going to be, that counterweight, and not necessarily China being the counterweight. Um, I find it difficult to see the BRICS necessarily as going to be that.
Mm.
And we know for a fact that there are many contradictions within the BRICS itself. Let's and those contradictions and those internal divisions, internal tensions within BRICS are not things we can just trivialize and just wish away.
Mm.
And so, if they are not things we can just trivialize or wish away, uh, what to what extent is that going to hamper the BRICS from becoming a united bloc that could actually put forward a vision of the world that would be different and would be something that other countries would be willing to actually um, support, would be willing to, you know, maybe join them in advocating for that kind of the world. Uh, and maybe because they have China, that creates a whole different dynamics because China, for now, appears to be the viable nation other than the United States capable of uh, global great power projection beyond their shores. They also have a, an economy that it's large, but going through a lot of problems right now. Um, and so the viability over there, even though it's shaky, is still a strong case for China. And China is having like a growing military power, an increasing military power that to some extent has even surpassed US when it comes to the number of ships that they have in terms of in their navy and all of that. Another important point that goes into the BRICS favor here would be their control of the major choke points in the world. So with the addition of the new countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and if they had succeeded in bringing Argentina on board, BRICS would have been controlling pretty much the major choke points in the world. That was a great geopolitical move by the Chinese and the Russians to have strategically chosen those countries to be part of the BRICS Plus. Um, and you could also see the economies as important economies in the world, especially Saudi Arabia control of oil, thinking about, the Suez Canal and all of that. So, yes, the BRICS has a lot of things in its favor, but I don't see them as the inevitable
Mm.
counterweight to the West.
Yes. So based off of what you've just said, especially with this point that you argue that BRICS is stronger because of individual nations such as China and the inclusion of these other strong nations, how do you think the US trade relations and economic policies towards these countries individually, such as South Africa's inclusion in the AGOA policy and other multilateral or unilateral country to country relations, how do you think BRICS Plus and BRICS expanding, how do you think this will impact the ongoing trade relations between the individual nations and the United States as country to country?
Uh, I th- I think that there is something interesting happening in in the South African US relationship, and that you could probably date it all the way back to 2017 under the Trump administration when the current president Cyril Ramaphosa was one of the few presidents that actually came out outright to say in the US China trade war, US is the aggressor. I mean, that was a geopolitical moment that many in the US actually noted because it was he wasn't being very diplomatic. He was just forthright. Um, the question, and I mean, it's he was able to point out, that the U.S., unlike some countries that were trying to be diplomatic and toying with the idea, oh, the two of you need to settle this. He's like, the US need to stop this because the US is the one that is starting this, you know? Um, and, and I mean, there are other notable moments in which the South African foreign policy had differed and to some extent challenged US foreign policy. Given those tensions and dynamics, depending upon who wins the next election, especially if Donald Trump wins, where I foresee that there's going to be a lot of focus on reciprocity,
Mm.
then I am not going to be surprised if there's a language about graduation in AGOA legislation
Mm.
and a push to create a multi-tiered AGOA that, to some extent, puts countries that are the major beneficiaries, like South Africa, in some kind of difficult place where they would either have to be graduated or they would have to get, uh, start negotiating some level of bilateral agreement with the US. If the Harris team wins, I know that there's not been a lot of appetite in the Biden administration for market access.
Mm.
So I see the Biden administration with the Harris administration uh, continuing on the same path of discussing economic partnership, economic development partnership with no market access. Um, so that would be potentially where what I see in depending upon what happens in the elections. The way BRICS helps South Africa, for example, then and to some extent Ethiopia, which has already been sanctioned under AGOA, is that they provide alternative market
Mm.
for their goods and services. The only challenge is that, meaning you have to retool, you have to, because 7 different markets, it's not easy for you to just switch your products hook, line, and sinker and said, hey, we used to export this to the US, so we could just send the same thing to China. We could send the same thing to Russia, and I don't necessarily see Russia and India as being that open to create market access
Mm.
for South Africa and be as lucrative as your BMs getting into the US market and
Mm.
that Goa. So there is a balancing act that is needed there, and this is why I appreciate the fact that the new unified government is working to smoothing its U.S. relationship.
Mm. Well, now I'm based off of the idea that the two different presidents and their two different perspectives and points of view and how their idealization of the South Africa US or Africa US or even US and other regions and blocks, their relationships with each other. I'd like to quickly go to a question in the chat from Mikateki Sokubai, who says, the doubts over BRICS have been there since its inception in 2009. The bloc has since grown and expanded its profile and scope. This is despite all the differences inherent between the relationships between some members at a bilateral level. Could it be that the lens through which the BRICS members view the world is different from that of the US or the West, at least from philosophical and cultural perspectives? And also leaning on to what you just previously said about the different perspectives and ideals of each of the candidates. How do you see this question that Mikatekiso has brought forward linking with the differences of the two candidates themselves?
Uh, I think this is a great question. This is in the sense that to think about how different states and different you know, uh, governments or regimes look
Mm,
at the world, it's very clear that the BRICS members have a different understanding and a different view of the world than Western states. The question in that regard then has to do with, okay, what is the difference? And how far apart are they, to the extent that either whether they could be breached or not, whether the gap between their world views could be breached. And what kind of world do those two perspectives bring, or what kind of world are they trying to create?
mm,
And on one level, I think that we have to be very careful in homogenizing the BRICS view as well.
mm,
Because within BRICS, we know that the Indian worldview is totally different from the Chinese worldview.
mm,
And so, and Ethiopia and to some extent Egypt has also demonstrated in the conversation about who gets the permanent seats related to the UN P5 or like Security Council, has also demonstrated that there is a multiplicity of worldviews
mm,
now going to be joining the BRICS plus. So the skepticism that mainly has expressed against the BRICS since its founding, there's nothing that has been demonstrated by the BRICS to quell that skepticism. And also, one of the reasons why the US became a dominant force post 1991, which I think a lot of people don't give enough credit for, was that the US was giving voice to many people's aspirations. They were not necessarily just giving voice, but they were also providing practical demonstrations of that aspirations. That
mm,
no matter who your parents are, no matter where you come from, the pursuit of happiness and the pursuit of freedom and liberty, it's within reach. There was, call it, the US has been a mobility country.
mm,
And yes, there is also now, the US is going through some challenges where it's getting difficult for people to realize that mobility in social status and economic affairs. But it still remains that for a long time, the West and the US, as its leader, had provided a way for people to actualize that aspiration. The question then becomes, will the BRICS world order that they want to create, to what extent would that allow us to enjoy significant freedom and liberty
mm,
and pursue, you know, our economic, political, cultural, social goals? Because to some extent, if China is the model of that future, then I think a lot of people in Africa have to be willing to cringe. Because do we want to live in a society where even every movement that you make is monitored by the government and you get a social credit score uh, that is penalizing or not? Uh,
mm,
and so I am not sure if they offer us a vision of the world in which we can sit back and glorify. However, they do point to significant problem in the current world order,
mm,
and that anybody who cares about the current world order also has to sit up and pay attention because it's not a perfect world order.
So now also linking to this current world order and things that are threatening to shift it or move its current standings and who is on top and who's in the middle or the bottom. What do you think the BRICS Plus nations idea or new approach of trying to introduce alternative currencies to the United States dollar in trade? What do you think this is going to do to this world order and the US dollar's strength and dominance in global markets? Because as we know, most countries have a negative balance of trade with China, where we see China being a major exporter to most nations. So now we see this as being something that is challenged by the introduction of these alternative currencies because most countries are already doing trade in dollars, but if they're importing a lot of their stuff from BRICS Plus nations, how do you think this changes the world order or the world economic order at least?
So, from my personal perspective, I don't necessarily see it as a giant shift in the world order. And here is why. There is no law under international treaties or anywhere that prohibits countries from trading in their own currencies.
Mm.
I mean, and at the same time, central banks, when they are actually stabilizing their currencies, they want to hold stable currencies as much as possible. So I see the dollar as still being in that mix of currencies, basket of currencies that they hold in some ways. So there's going to still be a high demand for the dollar from that perspective. The other perspective then would also be citizens that of these different countries that want to hold the dollar to preserve the value of their currencies because the local currencies probably are depreciating too much.
Mm.
So there's always going to be some demand for the dollar outside of the US. The question becomes whether that demand is going to be enough to cushion whatever trade that is no longer going to be done in the US dollars. And another way we can also think about the current US position in the global economy is to think about US as an embedded power. Mm-hmm. So the whole notion of embedded power is that there are a lot of things that South Africa does in its economy now that it relies on US technology, relies on US, you know, goods and services inputs, without which maybe the level at which you would have done that would not have been as advanced as it is now. And so because the US is critical enabler in your economy, no matter what you do, you are not able to totally shift away from the US. It's the same with realizing that even the Hezbollah uses walkie-talkies that have US technology in them, even though they are an avowed US, critic. Russia's, for all Russia's boastful attitude, depends on US technology for its military equipment. And so that gives US some kind of power that I don't think US lawmakers even understand what that power is yet, because scholars are still figuring that out.
Yes. Now, based off of that, do you think using that power or the dominance or the role that they have that's embedded into most economies and political systems, do you think that the US needs to actively compete and engage with the BRICS nations directly rather than simply remaining having the idea that the existing status quo or their embeddedness is sufficient to not lure other countries to join the BRICS nations? Do you think that the US active needs to take an active stance or a passive stance? Or the passive current stance of not taking any policy, using policy, using soft power, using hard power, using military, using trade? Do you see them having to take that type of stance, or do you think they can continue with the current relatively passive stance they've taken towards BRICS?
Uh, I don't think the BRICS is going anywhere soon. I
Mm,
am not as pessimistic about BRICS as some scholars are.
mm,
Um, Even though I don't necessarily see them as going to be the geopolitical heavyweights, counterweights to the US necessarily. Uh, but I don't think they're going anywhere soon. And so some kind of engagement with the BRICS would be useful. And the US does have significant cooperation with many of the BRICS nations.
mm,
So it would be in the US interest to continue to monitor and continue to engage with BRICS on multiple levels. And let's also not underestimate another thing that is happening. Even though we are talking about, the multilateral system being under stress, we also see a yearning for multilateralism in many parts of the world. And BRICS is one example of that, where and so at the time when the norms, the institutions of multilateralism has come under threat, that's the
mm,
same time we're seeing fragmentation and proliferations of multilateral platforms. And we should see BRICS from that perspective, that countries want to associate, countries want to get together to get things done because they realize that alone they are not able to solve the emerging problems in their economy, in their regions, in the international sphere. They need to develop that kind of solidarity with other nation states.
mm,
And
mm,
if that is the case, then
mm,
I see a push for more people wanting to join BRICS because it looks like one of the clubs that appears to be doing well so far.
mm.
And And in that case, then it's not necessarily US trying to foster a closer relationship, but US still needs to develop some kind of relationship.
Yes. And then regarding this yearning that you are seeing and people wanting to join BRICS, do you see that according to the perspective of the nations of BRICS wanting to increase their economic power and their economic strength, do you see them effectively increasing their economic power as the BRICS bloc, or do you think that their positionality would not should it focus more on other things in geopolitics, such as political power, military power based off of their populations? Or do you think that it's more reasonable for them to push more of an economic bloc rather than social or a geopolitical bloc more specifically?
So um this it's it's an interesting question, because I think what states do in some extent determined by the international system,
Mm,
the structure of that system dictates a lot or creates the constraints, the environment in which states act. So in some ways the action of states are predictable, huh? And in some ways, too, they are unpredictable because different regimes are going to adopt different survival strategies.
Mm,
So what we see in China is, a push or a shift from what you could call an outward looking survival strategy over the last couple since the Xi Jinping administration or regime got into power toward an inward looking survival strategy.
mm,
And that inward looking survival strategy it's been implemented in two different dimensions, which is a focus on internal development, which or the dual circulation economy, and also a push for military might.
mm,
What has that given China? What that has given China is it's created fear and panic in its neighborhood.
mm,
It has heightened security competition between China and Japan, South Korea to some extent, Australia to some extent.
mm,
Um, Before 2020, Australia was ambivalent to the whole shift of the US toward the Indo Pacific. But due to Chinese action, they have actually pushed Australia closer to the US position. So for me, then, if you ask my personal opinion, I think a geo-economic strategy might
mm,
be a lot better, focusing on improving people's life, focusing on growing their economy, to actually create hopeful situations for their citizens. It's a better use of their time than necessarily investing much more into the military domain. But
mm.
yet again, they need to secure their countries. They need to develop the capability to be able to defend themselves. um However, defensive need is different from offensive capacity build. And
Mm.
so when your capacity building, military might capacity building crosses a certain threshold, you go from purely defensive to an offensive realm. And this is where I think China has driven the conversation that other BRICS nations can learn from China.
Okay. So, before we go to our next topic or next touch point, I'd like to quickly address two questions that are in the chat. Both are also from Mikateki Sukubai. So the first one is regarding the idea of embeddedness that you stated. The question is that embeddedness not possibly why countries such as Turkey want to join BRICS to create an order that allows greater independence for each state? So that was also going back to the discussion of the world order that exists currently. And then the next one is based off of what was just spoken. How do we determine which administration is a regime or a state?
Uh, so going back to the Turkey question,
Mm,
let's not forget Turkey is a NATO member state
mm,
um, that has a strong man prime minister. That I mean, President Erdogan has positioned himself as a strong man um, in many ways that contradicts a lot of the NATO policies and NATO positions. And so he has a survival need to create strategic autonomy for his regime. And in that space, uh, you ought to give him some credit for looking toward BRICS as a potential ally in creating the strategic autonomy for him. Because to some extent, he's not allowed to buy some U.S. Equipment. He's not allowed to buy some U.S. technology because of his purchase of Russian S-400 and all that like authoritarian tendencies.
Mhm.
And then the second question that has to do with how do we determine which administration's regime or a state? Uh, I am not too sure what the word state here means because I mean states for a lack of you know political correctness is a very murky concept
Mhm.
that on one level we I mean political scientists struggle to define what that is. But then in terms of regime, uh we can look at what are the ideological foundation of that government and how that differs from the administrations that came before it. And what are the survival instincts or survival strategies of the different administrations? That would tell us regime what the regime positionality is.
Thank thank you for that. So now to slightly off ramp, but going back to one of the original points that we mentioned, is the implication for ongoing US politics with a great focus on the upcoming elections next month. So the next question that I'd like to ask you is, how do you see the growing influence of BRICS Plus playing into the narratives of each of the candidates or political parties that are running in the upcoming elections?
Uh, for for the most part, BRICS doesn't really feature in the election.
Mm.
I think it's much more China, not BRICS, that is seen as the number one geopolitical foe at this point, or the threat to the U.S. Um, led world order, and that features heavily in the conversations because to some extent the US sees countries like India as potential ally in its competition with China.
Mm.
And so if India, for example, is a potential ally, you don't want to necessarily demonize the whole BRICS. You don't necessarily want to go after uh, everything that BRICS stands for. So I do necessarily see that even in the last few days of the elections, I don't see BRICS coming up as uh, a major team
Mm.
in the electoral politics.
Mm. Well, also now going back to that, so even though it may not be a major theme that is mentioned in their manifestos or their policies that they mention, how do you think or how do you see the current economic challenges that are going on in the US, such as high unstable inflation and job losses related to the development and increase of BRICS nations and economies? How do you see those types of things, such as people feeling they are losing jobs to countries like India or China, or losing production capacity for industries such as steel? How do you see this impacting people in battleground states in the US where they depend on those types of industries such as steel mining and refinement? How do you see BRICS Plus actually playing a role in how the electorate will vote next month?
I am not sure if I really understand the question.
Mm.
Um,
So, what I meant is, so in the US, the main economic issues or crisis that is ongoing is that many people in primary industries and secondary industries, such as mining, and agriculture feel as though they are losing a lot of their the ability to compete in the market to countries within BRICS Plus, such as India or China. How do you think these voters will continue or move or change their voting patterns to address this? Do you see them moving more towards a Republican type of economic policy that is tough on China, tough on India, tough on imports of things that are in the US? Or do you see them wanting to shift more to a democratic economic policy that is not as economically tough against BRICS Plus nations?
I mean, I think that distinction, it's a very interesting distinction in terms of like the US in the economic policies of these different governments toward the external world, because to a lot of extent, the Biden administration has hewed closely to the Trump administration position on foreign trade. Um, for for all intent and purposes, the Democratic administrations in the past had been a, less welcoming to international trade compared to the Republicans before Trump. So I don't expect the Democrats to become paragons of free trade.
Mm.
I mean, the closest we came to the Democrats becoming paragons of free trade was NAFTA under Clinton. Since then, Obama wasn't really like a great champion of free trade either. I mean, he did negotiate a couple of like free trade agreements, but he wasn't, that forceful in support of international trade, the same way as other Republican regimes. So does that leave us with, you know, one government that is really opposed and one government that is lukewarm opposed? That's the situation we find ourselves in right now. And I must add that the Trump administration's position on trade is very outlandish. There are many people within the Republican administration or Republican Party that still support free trade, that wants uh, free trade to continue. The only problem is that they no longer enjoy the same level of political support among the base, as you were pointing out, because cost of living in the US is very, very, very expensive, um, and the question always has to come back to what are the factors that has made life so expensive in the US that people no longer see economic mobility as a possibility. And I think that um, the US, we in the US, we are not really having an honest conversation about that. And yeah, if you listen to the Republicans, it's just about the tax policy. It's about to some extent regulations that the deep states are actually imposing more hardship on people. And if you listen to uh, the Democrats, it's about lack of social infrastructure. It's it's more government that is needed to solve the problem. So at some point, the US policymakers, politicians have to have an honest conversation as to what is causing this economic anxiety and solve it. Because it's not the BRICS, definitely, that are stealing all the jobs. Because if you look at supply chain, um, if you look at trade from a supply chain's perspective, the deficit between US and China is a lot more smaller than if you just look at it as a holistic picture.
Mm. Okay. And then also now, what do you think the US presidential candidates need to do, or what could they or should they do to influence BRICS on global governance, especially in terms of human rights, climate policy, and peacekeeping. As we've seen, there have been conflicts in position of BRICS nations and the US based on war, based on climate change, their policies such as China's 2060 climate policy, or also in regards to human rights and what is seen as one side being perceived as oppressive and the other as more progressive, whilst both sides are actually actively engaging in what could be considered human rights, a degradation of human rights, whether in their own political boundaries or national boundaries or outside of them, such as the US supporting Israel. How do you think the US and BRICS nations need to do to do you see them influencing the other, or do you see one's role as undermining the other, as they are often diametrically opposed on these types of conversations? Whereas in some they are similar, such as climate change, US and China having a similar perspective.
Uh, so on one level, what China and the BRICS nation are asking for is respect.
Mm.
They want to be treated as equal partners, having equal seat at the table to discuss these issues. On another level, what these countries are putting on the table, yes, I've I in I in just a position to what the US and the West think they want, especially when it comes to the human rights question. So, is it possible for them to sit and reason with each other? Is it possible that there could be some compromise? I don't necessarily think so. And this is where the challenge for the what comes after becomes important, because I don't I don't know what kind of compromise the US can reach on the the Rohingya situation in China, for example. I don't know, right? What is the possible compromise here that we accept you creating internment camps or like re-education camps? Um,
Mm.
so on this kind of issues, then I think it becomes an issue of your friends, your allies, looking you straight in the eyes and telling you the truth. Um, that might move the needle a lot more than the people you consider your adversaries, pointing it out to you. So because if China would have changed, uh, the US and EU have done enough to point out the problem to China. So maybe it's the people that China trusts that might be able to point out some of these issues and have China seriously consider them as maybe this is not a kind of world we want to live in where a government can lock up people. But then US also has its own challenges when it comes to human rights. It has its own challenges when it comes to, some of its policies and how those policies undermine some of US values. Um, and how those policies lead to the killing of children and women and vulnerable populations around the world. So in this kind of case, then there has to be, call it, I would say, a reflexive conversation on both sides of the divide, where each one is looking at their own practices and to say, what can we improve here? And I would rather want to see that level of feedback seeking, that level of self correction, as a way to move the conversation forward rather than, am I going to be able to influence you to change your ways? Because even we all know in our own families, that's not always the case, that you can't change somebody else, you know, um, unless the person wants to change.
And then now, if you are looking at these upcoming elections, my second last question that I'll ask today is, if we are moving, or the US is moving towards an America first perspective, which is more isolating or isolated based on what Donald Trump and his previous or future administration wants to see happening, compared to the more immigrant-friendly messaging of the Democratic Party. How do you see this influencing the US's role in global governance? Do you see them having, whichever perspective they choose, where does this put them in global governance with the growth of emerging powers such as BRICS? And which one would be most effective towards keeping the US in the same position or global standing that it holds within global governance?
I think that irrespective of whatever happened during the election, the US at this point is finding itself in a situation where it is one out of many states, right? Uh, in terms of like the international relations or global governance. So it's no longer seen as the dominant force or the dominating force as it used to be. And I think that that has been a challenge for the US foreign policy community to accept, to just be another state. And so, irrespective of whether it's Donald Trump or it is Kamala Harris, the administration has to still come to grips or come to terms with that, to see the extent to which US power and US leadership has deteriorated, and to rebuild that, and to regain strength in US leadership. Because we know for a fact that US leadership is also critical to solving many of the global common problems. And so the US is not a country that can easily be ignored or should be ignored, because they bring a lot to the table. So now the question then that I think a lot of people are grappling with is, how will the US continue to be at the table? Will it be the head of the table? Will it just be like a round table where everybody is equal? Or what kind of differential treatment could be leveled here? And that balance, that balancing act is something that we haven't succeeded in finding a solution to yet, which we eventually have to. And I hope that the solution starts from US actually developing a new a grand strategy that looks at the world and how, first of all, it could realize that the world order it created had succeeded in actually empowering many countries. So if you are part of a community of empowered nation, it's different from a community of poor, sick, and bedeviled nations that the U.S. actually found itself in a community with after 1945. So how do you then allow states to be empowered and live with them rather than see them as threats to your interest?
So now I'll ask my last question before I jump back to the comments in the chat. So the last question I'd like to ask is, how important is it for the US to work with its allies, such as the EU, Japan, Australia, in crafting a response to BRICS? Should they create a strategy to counter the growing power of BRICS, or should they just leave things be as they are? And if they do, what should they do or what could they do to maintain the existing balance of power that exists globally, which is more towards their favor? So what do you think they should, and if they should, what should they do?
Uh, so I am not usually someone that support the whole balance of power idea because I
Mm,
don't believe that that kind of equilibrium exists in an ever-changing and ever-dynamic world. Uh, and so, the US and its allies to some extent continues to enjoy favorable conditions in the global economy, favorable conditions in multilateral institutions. So it's not necessarily them actually developing a counterweight to BRICS. It's actually BRICS challenging their positions in a lot of ways. So
mm,
I won't necessarily advocate for the US, you know, building an alliance to challenge the BRICS. What the US need to do um, is continue to double down on innovation, continue to double down on a decentralized or a police-centric political and economic system that the US has, and empowering individual innovation and individual creativity and participation in the economy. And this is exactly what the US has done post COVID, where the number of businesses that are being created in the US it's in the millions. There are more people that are willing to bring new solutions to the marketplace, both the marketplace of ideas, the marketplace of goods and services. So the US could benefit by working with its allies to continue to just dominate the innovation space, to continue to build the AI or the fourth industrial economy. And so rather than just, you know, seeing itself as in this lose-lose geopolitical competition with the BRICS. And if the US can do that, it would even help the BRICS because the BRICS are major trading partners in some ways with the US in terms of volume of trade. In many ways. So India, it's emerging as a major trading partner of the US. China is already there. Saudi Arabia has yes lost its oil trade with the US in some ways because the US is now energy independent, but Saudi Arabia continues to benefit from its partnership with the US. So all of these countries are great partners of the US, and it's in their interest to see the US grow and develop. And I think the US should focus on doing that.
mm. So to end off our conversation, I'll go back with a question from the YouTube chat. So this question is from Ndola Lisawa. So it's two questions that address the US dollar strength. So the first is, well, my view is that if the BRIC succeeds in uniting and building up this economic power block, it will affect the power of the US dollar because as it is, the US dollar is used as a gauge globally. And then the next part of this is, do you think that the power of the US dollar will sustain if the BRICS succeed?
Uh, because of the embeddedness of the US, the BRICS succeeding is indirectly going to benefit the US. Because in some ways, US investors are actually part of the Chinese success story, are part of the growing Indian story. And so from a financial perspective, no, if the BRICS succeed, it's not going to undermine US economic position in the world in any way. But from maybe the power of the dollar perspective, yes, the power of the dollar might weaken. However, I have already explained myself as to why I think that weakening might not be as substantial as other people advocate it would be. Uh, so yes, BRICS succeeding, great. Uh, and to what extent is that a challenge to the US success story? I don't really think so because US FDI, it's important in many of these countries. Until recently, even Russia was a major beneficiary of US FDI or Western FDI. And so the embeddedness of US in some of these economies allows them to continue to benefit from, the growth that we're going to see in the BRICS.
So I have one last question from the chat, and this will be our last question, our real last question this time. So the question is from Mikateki Sokuvai, and it says, but the 1945 world order has failed in its purpose as set out in the UN Charter. Many states have been disempowered, Africa by old and new scrambles, South America and other developing economies. Wages, including in the US, have not really grown much since the Great Depression in real terms. The wealthy have now become super wealthy. The Pact for the Future was adopted because the globe accepted the mistakes and failure of the order created in 1945. Do you think the BRICS must cease to exist? And yes. And if not, how do you think the BRICS must proceed?
I'm not necessarily sure if BRICS is the answer or the answer. It's an answer to the challenges that the world order, the post 1945 world order is facing, and it's not a panacea. It's not going to solve all the problems, and so multilateral forums like the African Union, with the AFCFTA, it's part of the solution. You also still have SADC as part of the solution. So BRICS alone is not going to be it. And I think we have to recognize that as well. However, I don't necessarily think that the existence of BRICS it's bad. I mean, BRICS is here. I don't think it's going anywhere soon, because some group of nations sees value in it, and as we are going to see in the end of October, many wannabe BRICS members states are going to join the BRICS Plus for their forum. There are many states clamoring to be part of the BRICS club. So BRICS is not going away. And I don't think it should go away. I think it offers some solution. It offers new forms of partnership. South Africa recently just got a 1 billion from the BRICS Development Bank to solve its water problem. So, there are so many other good things that could come out of BRICS. We should see it as part of the milieu of solutions that are needed to address the global common problems that we see, including climate change.
Thank you so much for your answer, and also thank you so much for joining us as a speaker today. This has been Pakwesi Heto. Thank you once again for joining us. And thank you to the audience, both on the Zoom and on YouTube. Thank you for being part of today's webinar. We will have the recording of this webinar on our YouTube page, so please check that platform and also keep up with our LinkedIn, where we'll be speaking about future activities, events, and engagements. And next week, please join us again at this exact same time. Different link, we will send and distribute the information. Next week's webinar, which is part of our countdown to the US elections series, will discuss the implications for Africa in the climate change and energy spheres. So if you're interested, please join us. Please share with anyone who you think may be interested. And we'll see you again next week. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.